There was a house in the mountains where a rule was followed every night without question. No one wrote it down, no one explained it to outsiders, but inside that house it was understood. When the clock got close to midnight, one of the sisters would stand up, take a lantern, and walk to the kitchen. She wouldn't say a word. The others wouldn't look at her. She would lift the trap door in the floor and carry a bowl down into the dark. No one followed. No one asked what was being fed or why it had to be done every single night. They just took turns, one after the other, for years. And in all that time, no one ever refused. Until one night, one of them did. Before we go deeper, pause for a moment. Imagine yourself in their shoes. What would you do if you discovered a secret your family had kept for generations? If you think you could handle the truth, or if you're too scared to, hit the like button and don't scroll away, because what comes next will change everything you thought you knew about this house. And if you want to see every detail, every shadow, every whisper, subscribe now and make sure you don't miss the rest. The house sat alone, deep in the Appalachian Mountains, surrounded by dense forest that stretched for miles. The roads that led there had long fallen out of use, and the towns nearby spoke little of what went on inside. Inside, the three sisters lived quietly. Mary, the eldest, kept order with careful hands. Ruth, the middle one, watched and followed. And Eliza, the youngest, moved differently. She asked questions no one answered and noticed things that were usually overlooked. By day, the house seemed normal. Chores were done, the stove was tended, windows were washed. The mountain wind pressed against the walls, carrying with it the scent of pine and damp earth. But subtle unease lingered in every corner. A door that always stayed closed, footsteps that paused when no one else was around. Whispers of past voices carried faintly in the hallways. No one spoke of it, and yet everyone felt it. At night, when the house went quiet, that feeling grew heavier, pressing down like a weight. And when the clock neared midnight, the rule reasserted itself in a ritual none could escape. By midnight, the routine began. One sister would rise, lantern in hand. She moved silently, as if the house itself demanded it. The others watched without speaking, their eyes fixed on the floorboards, their faces calm but tense. On the kitchen table sat a small bowl, covered with a cloth. Its contents remained a secret, hidden even from the sisters themselves. No one explained what it was, and no one asked. They simply knew what had to be done. The trapdoor in the floor creaked as it opened, revealing the darkness below. One sister would step into the blackened space, carrying the bowl carefully. From above, the other two remained still. There was nothing to see, nothing to hear, except the faint echo of footsteps disappearing into the dark. When she returned, she said nothing. Her hands sometimes shook, her eyes sometimes held shadows no one could name. The bowl was washed, the cloth replaced, and the ritual would be ready for the next night. No one ever missed a turn. No one ever refused. Until now. Eliza noticed things. Small things at first, easy to dismiss, like the way Mary's hands lingered over the basin long after they were clean, or how Ruth's eyes would dart to the trapdoor even when the lantern wasn't lit. Sometimes, the sisters would walk past the cellar door in silence, pretending it didn't exist. but the air around it felt different, heavier, cooler. Even the shadows seemed to bend toward it. Eliza began to pay attention to the sounds in the house, the ones no one else acknowledged. The floorboards sometimes creaked in patterns that didn't match their steps. Faint whispers drifted from the cellar, too soft to catch clearly, like voices carried through a tunnel of stone. She could never be certain if she imagined them, or if they were real. At night, she would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to the rhythm of the house breathing. And always, at the edge of her hearing, there was something else. A sound so quiet, so deliberate, that it made her skin tighten and her heart slow to a cautious pulse. The sisters never spoke of it. They never acknowledged what she noticed. Mary would change the subject if Eliza tried. Ruth would glance at her, eyes full of warning, as if to say, "Don't dig any deeper." But the curiosity had taken root. One evening, Eliza found herself near the cellar door when Mary and Ruth were occupied. She pressed her hand against the wood. Cold, older than it should have been. She whispered, half to herself, half to the silence, "What is down there?" The house offered no answer, only a soft shifting, as if whatever lay below was listening. That night, when it was Mary's turn to go down, Eliza watched from a distance, her lantern held tight in trembling hands. Mary disappeared into the darkness of the trapdoor. A moment later, there was a faint sound, not footsteps, not the shuffle of a bowl, but something else, like a sigh carried from deep below the floorboards. Eliza's stomach knotted. Her pulse beat against her ribs as if it wanted to escape. When Mary reappeared, she looked pale, but her face remained unreadable. She set the bowl down carefully, then returned to her seat. Eliza noticed something else that night. A smell, subtle but unmistakable. Damp, metallic, earthy. Something that seemed older than the house, older than the mountains themselves. She could taste it faintly in the air. Over the following nights, the feeling grew. Each step toward the cellar door felt heavier. Every creak, every shadow, every whisper seemed to stretch longer, linger longer. The house was changing. Or perhaps she was noticing the things everyone else ignored. And then it spoke. Not in words, not clearly, but a voice, or voices, drifting up from the cellar, barely audible, repeating a single, chilling syllable. More. Eliza jerked her hand away from the door. The lantern flickered as if startled. She took a step back, heart hammering, and looked at her sisters. Mary and Ruth were calm, as if nothing had happened, but their eyes held something. Something old. Something that had seen her noticing. Eliza realized she had crossed an invisible line. The ritual was not merely a duty. It was a rule woven into the house itself, into the very lives of her family. And questioning it had drawn her closer to the thing waiting below than she had ever been before. Eliza could no longer ignore it. The ritual was more than habit, more than tradition. There was a weight behind it, a necessity that pressed down on every corner of the house, on every step she took, on every word she did not speak. One evening, after the others had gone to bed, she found herself lingering in the kitchen. The trapdoor loomed at the edge of the room, a dark rectangle in the wooden floor. She ran her fingers along its edges. Cold, older than the wood around it. She shivered. She remembered the way her mother used to move, long ago. The stories the townspeople whispered when she was very young, about family, about a house in the mountains, about what was kept hidden. But those stories were dismissed, buried in time. And yet, looking at the trapdoor, looking at the bowl waiting silently on the table, she understood now that the truth had never been fully told. She tried to ask her sisters, "Mary? Ruth? What is it down there?" Mary's hands paused over the lantern. Ruth's head dipped slightly, her eyes dark pools in the candlelight. There was a long, measured silence. Finally, Mary spoke, low and steady, words meant to settle rather than explain. "It's been here longer than any of us." Ruth added, almost in a whisper, as if afraid to give too much away, "Our mother fed it. Her mother did too. Before her, the same." Eliza's mind raced. A thing so ancient, so entrenched in the family, that each generation participated without question. And yet, she had been told nothing of its nature. Not a word, not a hint. What is it?" Mary did not answer. She just looked at Eliza with an intensity that was almost unbearable, a gaze that carried the weight of decades of unspoken knowledge. "You'll understand when it's your turn," Mary said finally. Her voice was calm, but there was a tremor in it that Eliza could not ignore. It was a warning, a statement of fact, a line she had crossed by asking the question. Eliza left the room with more questions than answers. Her thoughts churned as she climbed the stairs, heart pounding, trying to ignore the faint hum that seemed to echo from beneath the trapdoor. She tried to sleep, but the house refused to be still. The boards whispered, the shadows stretched, and somewhere below, a presence waited. Patient, watching, unmoving. For the first time, Eliza realized that the ritual had never been about obedience alone. It had been about keeping something contained, something that, if left unfed, would move. And now, knowing even a fraction of its purpose, she felt the tension in her chest grow. The air itself seemed heavier in the hallway, thicker in the corners of the room. The silence was alive. She began to notice more details that the others had ignored, or chosen to ignore. The way the lantern light flickered across the floor, catching on scratches that weren't there yesterday. The smell in the air, earthy, metallic, faintly sour, lingering near the trap door. The faintest vibration under her feet, almost imperceptible, like the pulse of something immense breathing beneath the house. It was in these moments, in the quiet hours before midnight, that the truth pressed against her mind. She could no longer pretend she didn't see what was there. She had already seen too much. She had already heard too much. And each revelation drew her closer to a choice she was not yet ready to make. That choice would come soon, sooner than she could have anticipated. Because the rules of the house were absolute, and the thing below had always been patient. And when her turn finally came, there would be no turning back. The night arrived like any other. The wind pressed against the windows, carrying the scent of damp leaves and stone. Inside, the house was still. The sisters sat at the table, the air thick with expectation, their lanterns casting long, trembling shadows against the walls. It was Eliza's turn. She had spent hours watching, listening, feeling the weight of the house, the weight of her own hesitation. Every step toward the trap door felt heavier than the one before. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached for the lantern. Her sisters, calm but watchful, made no move to stop her. They only waited, their faces quiet but intense, their eyes reflecting the faint glow of the flickering flame. Eliza's heart pounded. She remembered the whispers, the subtle vibrations under the floorboards, the cold that seemed to rise from the trap door itself. She thought of the bowl, carefully covered, waiting silently in the kitchen. And she thought of what Mary and Ruth had said.
words that were more warning than explanation. She stopped. Her hand hovered over the trap door. Her fingers clenched the edge of the lantern. She glanced at her sisters, and for the first time she saw fear reflected in their eyes. Not fear of her, but fear of what she might choose. A silence fell, thick and heavy, that seemed to press against every corner of the room. Even the fire in the hearth flickered, as if uncertain, unsure whether it should continue burning. Eliza took a deep breath, and then, deliberately, she stepped back. She refused. The word was silent, carried only in the shift of her posture, the way she turned from the trap door and faced her sisters. A ripple passed through the room, subtle at first, almost imperceptible, like the trembling of a spiderweb in the breeze. Then came the reaction. Mary's face tightened. Ruth's eyes widened. Neither spoke, but the tension between them was sharp, like steel scraping against stone. The air itself seemed to quiver, charged with an energy Eliza could feel pressing against her chest. She had expected resistance. She had expected anger. She had not expected the palpable pause that stretched across the room, the quiet that pressed against her ears, the way the house itself seemed to hold its breath. And then, almost imperceptibly, a sound came from below. A shifting, a movement, the faintest scrape, like fingernails along stone. The vibration under her feet grew slightly stronger. It was subtle, almost casual, but deliberate, patient, waiting. Eliza felt it, the presence she had sensed for so long, the thing that had always been fed without question, the thing that had always been quiet, obedient to the ritual. Now, it was aware. Her sisters did not move. They did not intervene. Their eyes remained fixed on her, a mixture of warning and inevitability. Eliza's breath quickened. The lantern trembled slightly in her hand. She felt the pull of the trap door, not physical, but in some other way she could not explain, a tug at her mind, at her body, at something deep in her chest. And yet, she stood firm. She had refused. The house seemed to exhale, slowly, as if acknowledging the act. And then the waiting began. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. Time seemed to stretch in the room, elongated by the silence and the quiet tremors beneath the floor. Eliza felt the weight of every heartbeat, every breath, every sound she had ignored before, pressing against her, reminding her of the rule that had been broken. She had done what no one before her had dared, and in doing so, she had set in motion a series of events that could not be undone. Something had noticed. Something was moving, and it would not be satisfied with waiting much longer. The night after Eliza refused, the house felt different. Not broken, not changed in ways that could be seen immediately, but altered in the smallest, almost imperceptible ways. The air seemed heavier in the hallways, thick and cold. Shadows lingered longer at the edges of rooms, stretching unnaturally toward the trap door in the floor. The floorboards creaked in ways they had never done before, each groan echoing through the silent house, resonating like a warning.
Mary and Ruth moved with a new caution. Their routines remained, but their faces were taut, their eyes darting more often toward the cellar. Their whispers, when they spoke at all, were shorter, more careful, as if the air itself might carry their words down into the darkness. Eliza noticed the subtle signs first. The bowl, left clean on the counter, seemed somehow heavier, as though it remembered what had been in it. The lanterns flickered more often, shadows twisting across the walls in shapes that made her catch her breath. She began to feel a presence in the corners of her vision, something that left no trace when she turned to look directly. At night, the cellar itself seemed to hum. Not a sound one could name, not a voice, Something beneath the floorboards shifted, soft, deliberate, patient. It moved in patterns that could only be felt. The house responded. Even the fire in the hearth seemed reluctant to burn, the logs smoldering without flame, a faint smoke curling into the corners as if it, too, was wary of the thing below. The first night, nothing happened. The house remained silent, but Eliza could not sleep. Every creak, every sigh, every distant rustle felt magnified. Her own heartbeat thumped in her ears, loud enough that she imagined it might be heard below. She counted the seconds, the minutes, the hours, waiting for some sign that the rule had consequences beyond what she could see. The second night brought more. A faint scraping beneath the floor, rhythmic and precise, as if something was testing the boundaries of its confinement. A whisper, so soft it could have been imagined, drifted upward. "You refused." Eliza froze. Her lantern trembled in her hand, its light flickering across the walls, catching on scratches that had never been there before. Mary and Ruth remained quiet. Their eyes, once calm, now held a tension that seemed impossible to bear. They did not speak. Their stillness was louder than any words could have been. The third night, the weight of the house pressed down in a way that was almost physical. Doors that had always closed easily now groaned, reluctant. Windows rattled without wind. And the trap door, it pulsed subtly, a vibration that traveled through the wooden boards beneath her feet, felt in her bones. Eliza began to understand something essential. The ritual had never been about feeding. It had been about maintaining balance, keeping a presence restrained. And now, having refused, she had shifted that balance. Every shadow in the house seemed to lean toward the trapdoor. Every sound carried more weight. Every glance she cast toward it drew her in, demanding her attention. She began to feel the inevitability of what was coming, the slow but unstoppable movement of something that had been patient for generations. The air itself carried a warning. The scent of earth and something older, darker, reached her even in the light of the lamps. She could taste it faintly, metallic and bitter, and it made her stomach tighten. Even the sisters, seasoned and unflinching in their routines, showed signs of strain. Mary's hands shook slightly when she carried the water. Ruth's eyes widened at noises that had always been ignored. And yet, the house remained quiet, almost too quiet, holding its breath for the moment when the rule would demand fulfillment. Eliza's mind raced. She could feel it now, more than ever. The consequence of her choice was coming. The thing below was aware, patient, deliberate. It was waiting, and it would not remain quiet for long. The night stretched, each hour a drawn-out tension, each shadow a reminder. The sisters moved through the house as if walking in a dream, their movements precise, careful, wary of what the house might allow them to see. And Eliza, in the center of it all, felt the weight of generations pressing down on her shoulders, the knowledge that she had broken a rule older than she could comprehend. And when the first sound came from the trap door that night, a scraping, slow and deliberate, she knew with a certainty that made her stomach sink. The waiting was over. By the third night, the house had changed. It was no longer just a home. It had become a sentinel, watching, waiting, pressing against the edges of every thought. Every creak in the floorboards felt deliberate, every shadow deliberate, every flicker of light meaningful. Mary paced quietly, her steps measured but tense. Her hands trembled slightly when she lifted water or adjusted the fire. She spoke rarely, each word weighed and slow. Ruth, normally quiet and obedient, no longer dared look at the trapdoor directly. Her gaze flicked constantly, darting toward the darkened floor, then away, like a bird afraid of seeing the hunter. Eliza felt it most acutely. Every movement she made, every breath she took, seemed magnified, watched, measured. She could hear the faintest vibrations beneath the boards, subtle and rhythmic, as if something below was testing her, aware that she had broken the order that had been maintained for generations. And then, the first real sign. It came as a knock, not sudden, not violent. 3 measured raps, one after another, soft but unmistakable, echoing from the trap door. Eliza's stomach twisted. The sound carried a weight beyond reason. She felt it reverberate through the floor, up her legs, pressing at her chest. It was deliberate, patient, waiting. Mary and Ruth did not flinch outwardly. Their faces remained calm, but their eyes betrayed everything. There was fear there, not of Eliza, but of what she had done, of what had been unleashed. Eliza's breath quickened. She felt the pull, subtle but insistent, from the cellar below. She could sense something there, something waiting, something that had been restrained for generations, and now, having been refused, it stirred. The air in the room thickened. It smelled of damp stone, of earth, of a cold metallic tang that seemed to coat the tongue. The lantern flickered, shadows stretching across the walls like reaching fingers. Every corner of the room felt alive. Ruth, almost inaudibly, "It knows she refused." Mary's hand clamped briefly over hers, a warning, but not a comfort. The calmness of their movements was brittle. Every glance toward the trap door carried an unspoken urgency, a tension that pressed on Eliza as heavily as the house itself. The knocking continued, irregular now, shifting in tone, each tap deliberate, testing the boundaries of the floor. Eliza's heartbeat became a drum in her ears. Her hands shook slightly as she gripped the lantern. The shadows around her seemed to pulse with each strike, moving closer without moving at all. For the first time, the sisters spoke together, quietly, low enough that the walls themselves might not carry the words. "She can't ignore it. She can't pretend it won't come." Eliza felt the weight of their words, but also the responsibility pressing down on her. She had made a choice, and choices in that house carried consequences heavier than any mountain stone. She could feel it watching, waiting, measuring, considering each step she took. Time stretched. Moments expanded unnaturally. The sound beneath the boards shifted again, now a subtle dragging, a scrape along stone that made the hairs on her arms stand upright. The house seemed to inhale, hold, exhale in rhythm with the movements below. And in that silence, that waiting, she understood fully. The thing in the cellar had always been patient, always deliberate. It had waited through generations. It had obeyed rules older than the house itself. But now, with the ritual broken, with her refusal, the balance is gone. Eliza's mind raced. She could feel her pulse, could hear it echoing, loud enough to be heard below. Every instinct screamed to flee, to ignore, to hide. But the house would not allow it. The sisters would not allow it. And the thing below, it would not wait forever. The room felt impossibly small, constricted by the unseen presence beneath the floor. Shadows reached, sounds stretched. The air itself seemed to thicken, pressing against the chest, against the mind. Eliza understood something then, with a clarity that made her shiver. The choice she had made was irreversible. Every heartbeat, every sound, every flicker of light in that house now belonged to the consequences of refusal. And whatever stirred below was no longer patient. The house had grown restless. The walls seemed to lean inward, the shadows stretching further, swallowing corners that once held only darkness. Every sound was amplified. The whisper of the wind against the shutters, the scrape of the floorboards, the faint metallic scent that hung in the air like a warning. Eliza stood at the edge of the trapdoor,
lantern in hand. Her hands trembled, her pulse hammering in her chest. The house pressed against her, subtle, unrelenting, alive. From below, a sound broke the silence. Not a crash, not a roar, but a careful, deliberate shifting. Something moving just out of sight, testing the boundaries of its confinement. A subtle vibration traveled through the floorboards, up into her feet, her legs, her chest. She could feel it in the marrow of her bones. The knocking began again. 3 slow, deliberate raps. Then a pause. Then a soft scraping, like fingernails tracing the stone beneath the trapdoor. It was measured, patient. Yet there was a hunger in the rhythm, a quiet insistence that made her skin prickle.
Mary and Ruth did not move, but their eyes were wide, fixed on her. They did not speak. Their faces were calm, but tension coiled in their muscles, ready to spring. Eliza understood without words. Whatever waited below had noticed her refusal, and now it was responding. She swallowed, lantern held tight. Her legs shook. The weight of generations pressed on her, heavy, unrelenting. She could almost feel the presence behind her eyes, in the corners of her mind, in the air around her. The house groaned as if acknowledging the tension, each floorboard vibrating beneath her feet. A draft of cold air whispered from the trapdoor, brushing against her face, carrying a faint, bitter smell of earth and stone, as if the cellar itself exhaled. Then it shifted again. Something pushed against the boundaries of the trapdoor, soft at first, almost a vibration, then stronger, deliberate, testing her. Testing the fragile boundary between obedience and defiance. Eliza's breath caught in her throat. Her heartbeat thundered, each thump echoing in her ears like a warning bell. She glanced at her sisters. Mary's hands were clenched. Ruth's eyes flitted to the ceiling as if praying. They did not move to stop her, but their silence was heavier than any command. A scraping sound grew louder beneath the floor, following a rhythm. Eliza felt it, a subtle pull at her mind, drawing her toward the trapdoor, testing her will. She understood the rule in a way she never had before. This was not a ritual for ceremony. This was containment. This was order. And she had broken it. The air thickened, the shadows deepened, and the room seemed impossibly small. The lantern flickered wildly, casting sharp, twisting shapes across the walls. Every instinct screamed to step back, to ignore the sound, to flee. But she could not. The knocking stopped. Silence filled the room, dense, oppressive, as if the house itself were holding its breath. Then, a whisper, faint and deliberate, rose from below. "Your turn." Eliza froze. Her hands shook. The lantern's light wavered across the boards. The weight of the house, the presence beneath, the tension of generations pressed down on her chest. The house exhaled, slowly, deliberately. And in that moment Eliza knew. The choice had been made. The consequences were unfolding, and there would be no escape from what awaited below. She could feel the pull now, stronger, insistent, demanding. Every instinct, every fiber of her being screamed at her to obey. Yet the act of refusal still held her frozen, caught between defiance and fear. And then the trapdoor shifted slightly, just enough for a shadow to appear at its edges. Movement, deliberate, patient, aware.
Something was testing her resolve, measuring, waiting, seeing if she would yield. Eliza took a step back. She gripped the lantern tighter. Her breath came in shallow bursts. The house seemed to press down on her shoulders. The shadows pressed in, stretching across walls, pooling at her feet, reaching for her. And yet, she stood firm. For the first time, she realized the truth of the house. It did not forgive. It did not forget. It waited, patient, deliberate, immovable. And now it had noticed her. Eliza stood frozen at the edge of the trapdoor, lantern trembling in her hand. The air pressed down on her, thick and unyielding. The house seemed to inhale, and then, for a brief instant, all was still. Then she saw it. Not in the form she expected, not monstrous or grotesque, not screaming or violent. Instead, it was ordinary, and yet entirely wrong. The trapdoor shifted, just a fraction, enough for a sliver of light to catch something beneath. Movement. Shapes that seemed familiar, almost human, yet warped in ways that made her stomach churn. Something that had been fed for generations now regarded her directly, silent, patient, waiting. And then the whispers came again, soft, urgent, layered in voices she recognized, familiar names, familiar tones, but distorted. Echoes of her ancestors, of sisters long gone, of voices that had once obeyed the rule without question. Why refused? Eliza's knees went weak. The weight of generations pressed down on her chest. The house trembled subtly, almost imperceptibly, as if acknowledging her defiance. Mary and Ruth remained near the table, watching silently, their faces unreadable. But their eyes spoke volumes: fear, resignation, understanding. They knew what Eliza had done, and they knew what was coming. The truth she had glimpsed was staggering. The ritual had never been about feeding. It had been about balance, about holding something contained, something that had existed alongside the family for centuries. It had waited, patiently, in the cellar. And for generations the sisters had obeyed, not out of superstition, but out of survival. Eliza now realized she had broken that survival.
The movement beneath the trapdoor grew deliberate. A faint thump, then a shift, then a subtle scraping, closer, deliberate, testing the limits of its confinement. The shadows in the room stretched toward her, bending unnaturally, as if drawn to the presence below. And then, the twist. It did not attack. It did not roar. It simply waited, observing, measuring. The weight of its patience was a force heavier than fear itself. And in that moment, Eliza understood the final truth. She could not unmake what she had done. The house would not forgive. The thing below would not relent. It was not monstrous. It was inevitable. And as the lantern flickered, casting jagged shadows across the walls, Eliza's own reflection in the glass seemed to shift, hinting at a connection she could not yet comprehend. The cellar had been feeding on more than food. It had been feeding on obedience, on silence, on generations of compliance. And now, it was hungry. The sisters, silent and watching, understood that her refusal had changed everything. The rule had been broken. The balance had shifted.
The consequence was now in motion, and the house, patient as always, would see it through. The camera, or the narration in documentary style, lingers. The trap door sits still, the lantern flickers, and the audience is left with one unshakable truth. Some rules are older than memory, and breaking them carries a cost that even courage cannot escape. The sisters learned the hard way. Some rules are older than memory, and some secrets refuse to stay buried. If you felt the tension, if your heart raced with every creak of the floorboards, share this story with someone who loves true horror and comment below. Would you dare refuse the rule? And don't forget, subscribe and turn on notifications. There are more stories waiting in the mountains, in the shadows, and in houses just like this one. You won't want to miss them.